morning, Whitney. I'm so excited for today's conversation. It's going to be a good one.
I don't even know what adjective to use. I am humbled and eager and, little butterflies, I think.
Good.
So do we have butterflies about today? Who is our guest?
We have a guest today, Dina Belle La Roche. Hi, Dina. Welcome to Untrained. Thanks for being here. And for the untrained audience, here's a little bit about Dina. Her life changed dramatically in 2001 after the death of her youngest sister, Tracy. And since then, her journey through grief has inspired her to advocate for greater grief and loss literacy. I personally found Dina at a workshop with the Institute of Coaching, and I immediately connected with her, but not just because of the subject of grief and loss, but I also know that she has a background in high-level sports, which I was very drawn to. Dina has held several senior leadership positions through her 3 decades in Canada's high-performance sports sector. She's worked for the Canadian Olympic Committee, Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, and since 2010, she's been a partner with Sport Law. And Sport Law is a company devoted to elevating sport, and we'll hear a little bit about her work today. And Dina is certified as a coach and an ICF coach, an integral coach and an ICF coach. And she just has a wealth of information. We're so excited to hear from you. Hi, Dina.
First of all, thank you. Any opportunity to dance with 2 beautiful souls. So I'm noticing that my soul's really feeling ignited, and it feels like it's going to be an exquisite, creative place for us to learn, to get to know each other, and then also to talk about what often people don't want to talk about because it makes them feel uncomfortable, and bearing witness to your pain makes me feel uncomfortable. So then I want to take you out of that lived experience because I don't even know how to support myself through a life loss, let alone, be witness to yours. So what has me, what's keeping me up at night in all kinds of ways is how to provide more grief and loss literacy, such as all of us, have this agility and facility to be with each other when life goes sideways.
I'm super selfish this morning, and I'm going to say it because I want to learn from you, Dina, because I am still a post-Olympian athlete who's still dealing with that identity loss or the identity shift. And on another hand, as a coach, I do help my clients process their grief when there is a sense of loss, when things feel kind of out of their control. So I feel very much, and I don't use selfish in a bad way, I feel very much like I want to have this conversation. That's why I reached out to you when I watched you on the IOC coaching webinar.
Yeah, she's texting me. You have to have her on. I was like, go for it.
I need
and
her.
then she's like, she said yes.
Yes. Yeah. And so a lot of times when I feel like I need the conversation, I'm like, there's got to be other people that need this conversation. And I've got a group of Olympic alumni females that I meet with. I actually missed the meeting yesterday, but we talk about this often. We're in our 40s. We have children. We're married. One person's about to have children. We're still processing our grief, our thoughts, our identity from that very intense period of our lives. And I love, that's why I said, is you said we have the ability to help each other through this process. And I was like, yes, tell us how to do that, because I think we're kind of on the edges of it as a group. But I would love to know how we can do that for each other better. And again, the one thing we untrain or we talk about in untraining is this idea we have to be singular in our journey, that we can do this as a team, as a group, and we can rely on each other. And I think that's such an important message that's why I said, because I'm like, yes, I'm so glad she's saying that we can do this together.
Yeah. And if we're trained. So this is an untraining and a training. So my intention for today is to give people a lot of permission and skills to turn towards the grief in one another, grief in ourselves and in one another. I love you use the literacy, grief literacy and grief language, in a lot of your beautiful writing and speaking on podcasts. So I want to honor you as like an advocate for the soul, and grief is a really big part of the human experience, and one that the cultures that we were trained in early, the sport culture, and then again, the way the sport culture is often mirrored in the corporate culture, there isn't a lot of space and room for grief. So we want to open it up and make some space.
Exactly.
So to get that started, you have written a lot, and I took some of the quotes that you put forth. And you said, my goal is to bring more grief and loss literacy to the world, and in particular to the world of sport. I've witnessed so much grief in sport over my 30 years of serving in the sector. So Iris and I were curious, 10 years from now, what would you hope to see in the sport world that's different than it is today and that you are working towards?
Wow. Well, how long do you have?
I know, that's why we made it longer.
I have a particular vision, and I think we are like cousins, right? Americans and Canadians. We have similar structures and systems and ethoses. I'm coming to you from the unceded Indigenous lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and being rooted, being honoring of what came before me, my past, my lineage, my ancestors, is so important in helping us understand our origins and where we are now. And so if we think about sport lives inside an ecosystem that is part of our dominant, society. And there, at least in Canada, there's a big push for us to be bigger, faster, stronger. That's the motto of the Olympic movement, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we think of higher, faster, stronger, there's little room there for us to be more pensive, more reflective, more in our bodies. It's so interesting. When I work with athletes, one of the things I'll ask them is, how are you feeling about the experience? Mm-hmm. And they don't have the language necessarily. They'll talk about their body as a gross object, right? Well, the pain is here, or I'm feeling this. But when I talk about their lived experience and understanding what they're experiencing, they often don't have that language. So when I think about Sportopia, a vision for what Canadian sport, what world sport could look like, it would be more inclusive. Mm-hmm. Right now it's white privileged.
Mm-hmm. And
people means ableist. Exactly. Yep. And it is masculine in its energy and its design. So masculine, not meaning, and more gendered, I'd say, more still skewed towards men over women. Think of the World Cup as language, for instance. I might be opening up a can of worms, but when we think of how we are communicating our intention, we call it the World Cup for men, and then we call it the Women's World Cup. We'll have the National Hockey League and then the Women's National Hockey League. So already sport is very masculine and male in its construct and design. And what I want to do is not do away with that. I want to complement it so that we have more yin to the yang, right? That there's more equanimity and balance. And that means a whole undoing, an untraining of the system and structures that underpin sport. So the policies, the procedures, all of those things that have been hardwired and designed into the governance systems, all those things need to be undone. And for us, 95% of sport in community is based on volunteers. And I'm not sure about you, but in Canada, the volunteers are not wanting to volunteer the way they used to. So this over-reliance on a fossil fuel, which is volunteerism, and we tend to get volunteers who will import how they were treated onto who? Children. And this is where children's experienced on fields of play in our neighborhoods. They're then asking themselves, do I really want to stay in? So when we get these super elite athletes, they are there in spite of the system, not because of the system. So I've been advocating for values, a management by values philosophy for 25 years. I've been advocating for more diversity and inclusion. And I've been advocating for more grief and loss literacy. Why? Because if we have an understanding of attachment theory, which is the underpinnings of it explains why we grieve when something has been taken from us, when there's a shattering of our hearts because we get attached to people and dreams and goals, right? And identities. Exactly. So when that gets shattered, our natural and involuntary response to that shattering, that loss, is grief. But we don't talk about grief that way, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Could you, I want to pick up on that last piece where you talk about the literacy and talk about training athletes to sort of be like, hey, my popsicle stick, because you used that metaphor on another podcast, like this thing that got broken is broken. Yeah. And I don't want to ignore, if an athlete broke their arm, we wouldn't ignore it. We would tend to it in all sorts of ways. So what do you offer athletes around the broken popsicle stick? Take us through sort of what you train people, how you teach them.
Well, I love that you're sharing that. And I think it's really important to acknowledge my initiating and where I'm putting a lot of my attention, Whitney, is on the system. Because what I am noticing is we're doing more and more. Oh, we'll just give more training, more individual support to the individual, when in fact, it's a systems problem, right? So the analogy I give is we can keep throwing, life preservers to people who are floating in a toxic pool. But if we don't deal with the toxic mess, we're just giving people, it's actually cruel and unusual punishment to keep people in a toxic environment.
That's how we feel as coaches very often with some of our clients.
That's one of the things that we wanted to talk about was drawing the parallels, right, from sport to the corporate world. One of the things you said was the disembodiment or having something outside of yourself, right? So I see that a lot in the corporate space where there's a disembodiment.
The transactional.
Yes, very transactional.
Our bodies are transactional. We are here to, achieve something as athletes or as corporate soldiers.
Oh, corporate soldiers. I haven't heard that one. I'm going to keep that one. I'm going to bring that up later, Whitney. But that's it. When I'm asking them, how do you feel about that situation? We go right into what's the process of fixing the situation. And I'm like, no, exactly. I'm not going to fix the situation. We're not fixing anything. We're going to talk about what this feels like. And using visualization or even having them dropping into their bodies is like it can feel really unsafe. And so there's not like a safety around dropping into your body. So
it's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, and it takes a lot of untraining. Somehow we sort of remove the heart of the person, the soul, the body, and think they're just a brain and a cognitive being, right?
And this, I just want to bring this in because we've laid the groundwork for this in our previous sessions and in our own untraining, is that we have designed a mindset that says, if I perform well and I get positive feedback about my performance and my value as a athlete, as a corporate, person, then I'm safe. But then you've got all this stuff that you've compartmentalized, these these losses that maybe you haven't processed that leads you to not feel safe in your skin. I mean, that was my experience. I know that's been your experience, Iris. So, we've been trained, just achieve the success and you will feel safe. But we haven't necessarily been taught to feel safe in our skin, literally as athletes who are training our bodies. So going back to your point, Dina, around if we can train people in these formative experiences, if we can create a culture that's interested in training people, how to help in a healthy way, manage loss, show up for our teammates around loss, as coaches show up for our athletes and ourselves around loss, because we are set up to lose at some point as athletes, how different we would be as humans than off in the corporate world if we had those skills.
My coach, who was an abusive coach physically and emotionally, it's so interesting you said, Dina, like people aren't trained to coach. So it's a systems problem. He was someone who took some fencing coaching mastery, no educational mastery, no mental health mastery, and came in and he was brutal. And that was okay because, we're going to win at all costs, and that's how sport is done. And if we're trying to go for an Olympic medal, we've got to be super aggressive.
He's just the tough male leader, as you said.
And even today, I've had this conversation with people and they're like, oh yeah, he was just really tough. I was like, no, he wasn't tough. He was abusive and it was traumatic. Anyways, but the loss piece. So I think sometimes the way he dealt with loss was very interesting. He would either make sure that you understood that you were blamed for the loss. So he would walk away before you would ever end the match. So we would, I'd be losing and towards the end, I kind of needed to turn around. I'd turn around, he was absent because it was my fault that we lost, right? So there's one way he dealt with that. And then there was screaming. There's lots of blame. There was never this sort of like, all right, how do we handle this together? So I kind of see that sometimes, and not in that extreme in the corporate sense, but there can be this like, he has some unresolved things and the way he's resolving it is to place it on to me. And now I'm carrying his unresolved loss. How can we do better systematically, right?
Dina, I would love for you to take this and speak from a systems level and personally, like, Iris, this athlete that had this experience, how would you work with her or what tools would you hand her?
Well, the first thing I want to do is just acknowledge Iris and the young you, the child that was subjected to abuse and maltreatment. And even if we extend grace to your coach, because we understand that he also grew up in a system. And so he coached to his ability and that system tolerated that kind of coaching because we were focused on outcomes. So if we take it back to your point, Whitney, around safety, psychological and physical safety, it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Yeah.
We can't get to self-actualization unless our safety needs are met. And then the next kind of stage there is, right, self-esteem and belonging. So when I was hearing you speak about safety, we want to feel safe so that we can belong. So I had this image of you, Iris, at 14 or 15, doing a shoulder check. It's like, where's my coach? He's gone. Because it then becomes a condition for you to feel like you belong. You need to satisfy his expectations of you. And we see the same thing with children, right? And parents. So I think, the I, the me, the we, and the all of us, the whole world, whether it's sport or I do a lot of work in the mental health profession domain, whether it's big business or corporations, we're all going through this natural, necessary, needed evolution. And I think that as we start to become more informed, more sensitive, more humble, we're going to have greater and greater skills to be able to deal with individuals and teams and then the system. But we can't just focus on the individual. So when I work with athletes, a lot of the times now, I only come through the window of the organization because I don't want to equip them with greater and greater capacity to bear greater and greater load, right? I feel it's cruel and unusual punishment for us to do that.
So I want to pause there because this is very different, particularly as coaches, right? We're often brought, help me, blah, blah,
exactly.
blah. And they're within a toxic system. So you're saying, I am not colluding with that.
That's right.
I have to be brought in through the door of the organization who knows what I am up to and supports what I am up to so that what I am equipping them to do can be supported by the culture versus giving them skills that are probably maybe make them feel literally unsafe given the culture of the.
Because now they know what they don't know. So, as coaches, right, we will talk about widening our window, right? Our window of tolerance to create resilience so that we can withstand greater and greater load. But if we keep doing that in spite of the system that's also doing its work, right? So challenging conventional norms, policies, what we would call culture, right? So I go in, I use a tool to be able to establish, well, tell me what your cultural DNA is. And they're like, I don't know. Like, well, we can look at your employee, feedback loops, and that's limiting. So I use an index, right? I use a culture index, and we brought one to sport where I understand using 10 factors, how safe and do people feel like they belong? Do they feel like they're working towards a vision and a mission and alignment with values? So once we have data, then we can play with the data to create some information that will move to some knowledge to create shared wisdom. And when we do that, then we have a sense of what is the culture? What are the rules of the pool? if I'm doing that, that's the we space, then I can better work at the individual level, right? Because often I'm brought in, I'm sure the two of you are as well. We got a problem person.
Yes.
Right.
Or the person just they're high performing, but they're friggin' miserable.
Right. So I deal with, as you do, we deal with high performers, right? Whether it's corporate athletes or it's, athletes, we're dealing with athletes, high performers, the less than 1%, who typically have endured and have met that less than 1% ratio because of their like dogged, desire to achieve an outcome so that they feel like they can belong, that they are worthy. Now we're making some generalizations there, but I want to deal with whole, healthy human sport, whole, healthy human systems. And you get to that when you're dealing with someone who's dying at end of life, they're not talking about how many boats they are, they had, or they're talking about they're longing to know that their life had meaning, that the people they loved most in the world, that they know that they matter to them. Because otherwise you get this like suffering at end of life where you have no more time left to make amends, to repair wrongdoings, to live the life that you said you always wanted to live.
I just want to take another moment there. Like there's some things you're saying that I just want to pause and sort of expand out, right? We're talking about the skills for grieving and how it all relates back to imagining ourselves at the end of life or the people we love at the end of life and what's really important. Just hold that space for a minute.
Yeah. And when you are studying, it's the meaning of life, right? What I'm seeing now is, especially the next generation, I have 3 children. They're 23, 20, and 18. So I'm immersed in that cohort. I would say they have inherited so much trauma, right? Planetary concerns, right? They're worried about safety around the wars. They're worried about all kinds of things. And then the pandemic came in and disrupted in their formative years their entire meaning making of, and they've grown up faster than I think children ought to have grown up, in a sense that was really the stability was missing for many of them. So when we start looking at things like ecosystems like sport, we have to understand that 95% of sport is designed and delivered in communities. And those people are not trained, as Iris said, in the emotional, social development of themselves first, right? Because I can only accompany people as far as I'm willing to go.
Yes.
Right. So if
I can't hold space for you to do something that makes me inherently uncomfortable, it won't work.
Exactly. Which is why I've developed a companioning model. And my big dream is to work with coaches, right? So people like you who have a love on to help support others in complementary to mental health professionals. Because so much of and I'll dance into the space of grief and loss now. So grief typically has been pathologized. It's not language that we're familiar. We don't usually use grief a lot more now since the pandemic than before, but it's not language that rolls off our tongue. And I'm completely bilingual. So in French, there is no word for grief, which is really interesting, right? And so as we start to understand, and we have the literacy to be able to understand attachment theory, right? John Bowlby's work, and how when we get attached to people, places, dreams, goals, pets, ideas, right? Relationships, and those relationships are fractured, then we can understand that there's going to be a grieving period. Yes. Grief is love, right? It's our expression of love. And when we understand that and we start imagining that children, what do? Right? They go to school and they play sports for the most part. That's how they create that sense of belonging. Belonging. And if I can feel and grow as a small child in community sport, then I'm going to end up being a more complete human, which is what I think our jobs are. Those athletes who end up tracking for the less than 1%, let it be because the system nurtured them, not in spite of it. And then that means that, little Iris, who had this horrific experience under a coach that was rewarded, I'm sure, for a certain ethos and ethic of coaching, we need to do better to ensure that those coaches understand human development, understand social emotional learning and what they can do, and then importantly, understand their own attachment to the outcome, which is win. So that when the loss gets triggered, they understand what their coping mechanism is. And, one of the things I think the two of you will find fascinating. So I've worked with some teams around rituals, the way we put our bag, on the pitch and line
Shoes
things
on.
up. But what we also need to understand is rituals can be healthy or unhealthy. Mm-hmm. And what I want to offer is when you've suffered a loss, right, you're going for gold and you lose, and now you've got a bronze medal match to have to refocus on. What do?
Right.
If you don't have a ritual to understand, well, and in teams, it gets complex because I have my way of coping. Yes. And we see the athletes, right? The more extroverted ones in the locker room and how they are before a game. Mm-hmm. So understanding, if we give people understanding around what's our way of coping, because coping is related to grief and loss. So if we understand that, we normalize it. We have a shared ritual to get through this moment, this fracture, this loss. Then we have to say, okay, well, we've got 48 hours. Let us all respect each other's coping practice. We understand this. We have the literacy. Then it's game on because we have a job to do. That feels so much more humanistic than get over it, move on, put it behind you. No tears, no time, right?
Buck up, buttercup, as you said.
I'm drawing a parallel to my clients because they're leaders of teams that lose, right? So I've got a ton of salespeople who they're all outcome oriented, right? They put up those numbers, the quotas, and the leaders are always like, I want to be an inspiring leader. I want to help them. I don't know how to do it, right? So I would love for you to maybe give an example or a story of a coach who could help a team even though they don't hit the number that they expected, even though they don't hit the quota, that they can help, right? So one, you said everybody has a different coping mechanism. So you as a coach, as a leader of a team, need to understand. So first of all, don't have teams of like 100, which I always find like fascinating. I'm like, how do you have a team of 100? That's bananas.
Right.
But you as a leader of a team need to know your people. You need to know how they grieve losses. That you need to know how they're inspired. You need to know how they work. You need to know the human being that's behind all that. Is there anything else you can help leaders or coaches as they're helping teams and with a loss like that and having to recover from that?
Sure. So let's go with the ritual. So with a team, I just ask them, how do we want to close off this experience? So we prepare for it. So if things go sideways, how do we want to be together? So we normalize. By doing that, we're legitimizing and normalizing that we're not always going to win, right? That what we hope is that we win when it matters most, when the world's watching, right? So we create a ritual around that. And, it's different for some people. I'll give you one example where I had everyone write down what they needed to let go of, like from the last match. So they write it down. We throw it in the middle, we light a fire. And people, as they're throwing it in, they're letting go. It's a conscious, I'm letting go of this, right? And then we name an intention for how we want to show up differently. Like the gift of the experience, what I need to let go of so I can prepare differently for this next. It's all about me. And then by naming it and sharing it with my teammates, they're now seeing me both be willing to let go of something that's private. I don't name that unless the team wants to do that. But then I'm also now giving myself time and permission to talk about how I want to show up in 2 days, right? And I also give them time. They need. So here's what I'm willing to let go of, fire. And then 24 hours later, here's what I'm ready to do now. So we're not like warp speeding things. So that's one example of a ritual. And there's many. And for you, Iris, I love the parallels with the corporate athlete. And what I would say is, so leaders need to be fierce around their vision. So where are we going? And if you have 100 people under you, then I hope you have 10 staff, right? 10 next level, because the rule of 10 for me applies. You need to know your people the way you know your phone number and area code. And so with one client, I had him take a pic. So everybody he had a picture of everyone. And his goal over the next year was to get to know each of these people. He had about 15 people that were under him. And so he had a picture, their name, their family, their spouse, their children, if they had them, their pet, their birthday, their favorite color. Like, he just started to create a story around each of his people. And that changed everything, because his vision when we were working together is that I want to be a more humanistic focused leader. I'm like, okay, well, what does that look like for you? Describe that to me. I want to know them the way I know my family. Okay. So then we created a practice for him to be able to do that. So, and I agree with you. There's a reason why, when we talk about teams, 5 to 7, right? The best boards are between 5 and 9, let's say. So 7, that's the reasonable number where you can get a small group of people who can change the world. Thank you, Margaret Mead. We can't do it if there's 100 of us. It's unfair, unrealistic. That's why in military practice, they had the squadrons, right? You bring things down, you reduce it like balsamic vinegar, right? To its like core essence. That's what's going to draw people in. And then, of course, if we know that we're playing together with other people who are part of this vision, then we have to do some collective work. But that teamwork, you need to create that right from the beginning, having those practices where that person knows that I belong, and I don't have to make it a condition of my outcome. So back to your question, what happens when we fail? Well, this is what we have to have a conversation about. How do we fail well? That's guided by our values. So in culture, the language of culture is values. So if you have values around inclusion and respect and integrity and accountability, then you've got to bake that shit right into your measurements of how you're going to reward people. Right now in sport, we reward outcomes, medals, and money. I'm inviting people to talk about a triple bottom line: money, medals, morals. Morals is the language of culture. And right now, culture is eating sport for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yes.
We got to do better, right?
Yes.
So we plan it in, we bake it in. So you failed you didn't achieve those quotas. Why not? And not why not. It's like, ooh, what is it about right now? If you had to guess, Iris, with all of your knowledge, what would be the reason why we're not meeting our quota? And what are we learning so we can shift strategy, right? Very different.
Right. Versus like some of our corporate people who the landscape is getting harder and harder, right, to sell, and the quotas are going up. And how does that leave the individuals feeling?
Well, exactly. And I don't know about you, but I'll complete with this. Like, we're seeing a whole reimagining. So I've been working in 33 years. From day one, I worked a 9-day week. From day one, I was 23 years old, already challenging work, right? So I worked 10 days and 9. So I could have a day of rest. So I think we're starting to see systemic reimaginings of what it means to live a happy, healthy life. And what I know to be true, I don't know about you, but if you treat people well and they have clarity, right? Brene Brown says, clear is kind. They're going to do the work. And more importantly, if you treat them well when their life goes sideways, that's going to breed a level. And I'm not going to say loyalty, because I think loyalty feels earned. Devotion. People will be devoted. So one of the things that I've done, I asked a funeral director this, like, what do you do when one of your staff people suffers a loss? He's like, I tell them to come back when they're ready. I'm like, really? So I started talking to corporate companies, because I'm really on fire now about inviting corporate companies to walk the talk with respect to bereavement care, for instance. Right? Or how are they showing their people that they care? So back to my funeral director, I said, well, what's the average? And he said, a couple of weeks. They come back in a couple of weeks. Of course they do, because they want to have some form of normalcy. But then life goes sideways again. They take a day off. Those are people that will be there for life. We're so focused on productivity at the expense of the human experience. But if we retain the top talent that we recruit, remember, right? Our best recruitment strategy is a retention strategy. We're bleeding billions of dollars because culture is eating strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And humans, the next generation, they want to be treated with care and kindness, and they feel the authenticity. They're just going to leave and go take another job, right? So I think we're beholden, right, to our capitalistic kind of society. I think it goes back to the reward system writ large, the economy, right? We need to be in better alignment with environment. There's a lot of environmental grief right now where people are just so anxious. We need to be in better alignment with what it means to work and play and not feel that they're so fractured. We need to be in better alignment with ourselves. That's where we started, the two of us. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to be in better alignment or alliance with each other. Well, again, if we keep downloading everything to the individual, they're like, I can't do any more training. It's not up to me, right?
Right. I'm going to let all that land.
I know. I was like, I have so many things. It's so amazing. I definitely agree with you. I think for me, as I take a step back, there has to be not just a sports systemic shift, but a shift in how we see success, right? So it's not just productivity, how much someone can do, but that we're more focused on the individual and being able to shift that culture, the capitalist culture. It's going to take a lot, but people have to sometimes do the hard thing, right? To say, I am going to take a break. I'm not going to answer all those emails. I'm not going to do that. Because if we, in some ways, I would say, like, if we continue to just be a part of the system and not create systems that work for us as human beings, we're just going to be complicit. We're going to continue to burn out.
Exactly, Iris.
You know, Dina, you said it, I think in the workshop, I was someone who was like, okay, well, I went to my sister's funeral. I think you went right away to something else to work. And it's the same thing. You know, we at the Olympic Games, not that was that, it was an intense experience at the Olympic Games. We didn't win a bronze medal, and immediately the next day it's like, okay, we need to start training for the next 4 years. There was no moment of dealing with that scenario. There's no closure. There was no ritual. There was no nothing.
I want to add a story because I think the other piece is that, again, it's sort of like the athletic endeavor becomes the way of managing our feelings. Like I look back to my younger self who had so much rage and anger and grief, but the way I managed it was working out 3 times a day. And I got applauded for it because I was training for a national team. And one year when I didn't win, I remember we didn't win. I went for a run afterwards. I then was traveling all night. When I got wherever I went for another long run, ridiculous behavior because I didn't know what else to do with my grief over that season being over and the containment of that being over and the loss and, all the other stuff that had sort of been building up. But I had no other skill other than overrun and sort of wear myself out. So I just also want to bring that piece in that, again, the sort of striving becomes our coping mechanism, which just keeps the grief stuck in there. It doesn't move it. And I want to go back a little bit to what you were talking about at the beginning of giving people permission slips. When you're allowed to be really upset that you didn't do well at the World Championships that year, right? And what could I have done, or how do we train teammates to sort of turn towards one another after really big losses for a different outcome other than going for a run?
Yeah, I'll just say the language for me is there is validation in bias to action, right? So it's like, oh, she's doing something about it. She's going for a run, or I've lost my job. I'm looking for another one, and I've made an Excel spreadsheet about all the jobs I'm going to apply for now. And I'm like, hold the phone. How do you feel about losing the job? What do you feel about that? So I think it's this in our culture. So we talk about systems. I love this, always bringing it back to the system.
I love that.
Yeah,
I love that. It's so healthy.
The system says, well, just fix it. And let's do, if you're actioning something and fixing it, then you're doing the right thing. And if you're just staying in place, we can't be
You're ascending. You're ascending.
Exactly. When grief is descending.
Descending.
Right?
So
I talked about, the mountain climber, which is what we tend to reward, the stoic mountain climber. We were talking about metaphors earlier, right? Before we began. And this is mining work. We need to go mine the gem that is grief. And David White has a beautiful poem that's actually in my book, right?
Yep.
So he talks about the small round coins that are thrown, wishes, right, that we throw in a well, and he calls it the well of grief. Well, if we don't give ourselves permission to pause, figure out what my grief is, and be willing to be with the experience that is shattered my assumptive world. That language is so important. And I would also offer, even when it's things that are chosen, so the chosen grief, which is often a disenfranchised grief. For instance, you chose to leave a marriage of 25 years and you are gutted after. People are like, you chose to leave the marriage. Why are you grieving? Shouldn't you be happy and out celebrating? So people don't understand grief and loss and the experience.
Yeah.
And when we do this work, what really helps, because we talked about mourning. Mourning is taking our grief public, right? When we take our grief public, we have a shared response to a loss. That's what we were speaking to in terms of rituals. But if I default, and I loved what you said, Iris, a bias to action, right? A bias to extroversion. In different cultures, there's a bias to introversion. And we know, corporate world, the introverts are the ones that are more effective, right? Are more valued by their employees and usually make more profitable decisions on behalf of the corporate world, right? So introverts tend to listen more generously. They tend to be more introspective. It's what Jim Collins says, the window and the mirror. When people are doing really well, I look out the window and I'm like, what can I do to help support more of this flourishing? When shit hits the fan, that same leader is looking at herself in the mirror and going, what do I need to do to help address this? So window and mirror. So the corporate parallels that Iris introduced early on is brilliant, because whether we're a corporate athlete or a school athlete or an athlete, what we need most are mentors, femtors, right? That believe in us, that can see stuff in us that no one else. That's coaching. And so when I teach athletes, the first thing I want to do is I need to work with the coach, because I can only take the athletes as far as the coach. And they're, as coaches now, professional coaches, we have to be really sensitive to the ecosystem we're coming into. And I think we can create unnecessary suffering by coming in and equipping people with greater and greater skills to withstand greater and greater toxicity, right? Because now they have language. They're like,
could you give us an example?
Yeah. So working with, for instance, if we're working with, let's go to corporate athletes, right? We're working with some clients, let's say, on how to handle conflict. So we want to be more generative in how we deal with tension, because tension is a healthy experience. And when I come in to do some work around culture, often people are like, I don't like the way she talks to me. So tone, right? Her communication skills. So we need to teach people to be more equipped to deal with tension and to play nice, right, with each other, so that it doesn't become unnecessary conflict, which then can slide into maltreatment. So bullying and harassment, discrimination, all of these things. But if we had attended to that early on, it would have been fine. So if we're dealing, though, with the two problem people, and the whole culture is sitting there and watching this as bystanders, and we're not dealing with the root cause around how are you holding people accountable? How are you dealing and rewarding good behavior? How are you socializing people to your culture around policies and procedures? So if we keep downloading it and waiting for the problem people to serve as our wake-up call, everybody else, this is the revolving nature. So I ask people, what's your retention strategy? In those cultures where they bring me in, they're getting people, their staying power, Whitney, because you had said that earlier on. We talked about resilience, right? Oh, they're so resilient. They can handle greater and greater load. Her mom just died, and she's Chouinard, skated the performance of her life 2 days after her mom died. We reward that. Bravery.
She's tough. She's tough.
She's so tough. Yeah.
In honor of her mom. Right? And I would say, so that is truthful. Whitney, you talked about run. So I wrote a blog called Run Therapy. Our bodies need to process. Yes. Grief is an emotional, physical, interpersonal, spiritual, embodied experience. It is not just a feeling. when we understand that your process to recover from a loss was to go out and run, you cannot outrun your grief. So
No,
notice you were running, Whitney, when you were running, and you might feel this too, Iris, when you're working out, do you ever cry? Do you ever like just release?
Oh yeah. Often I start and then I start crying. I'll call Iris and be like, I'm riding the Peloton and crying and I'm having a hot flash and I took my shirt off and it's just a mess.
Yeah. Well, for me, I would say it's anger because I was never allowed to be angry for the treatment. Right. So I was only allowed to like suck it up. They're beating you up. It's your fault. You've got to just deal with it, move on. And for me, I even did it this morning. I was biking and like listening to a song that had a lot of F words. And I was like, F word, F word, F word. And it's like, not that I'm angry at the world or angry, but I never had tools to process my anger. I was never allowed to be upset. So I think that's important too, is that, you know, you need that space as well. So yes, the movement for me is tapping into places I was never allowed to be.
Okay, beautiful.
One of the things I'm seeing emerge in you is you're finally pissed about some of the stuff that happened to you. You're pissed and you're like, that's unacceptable. And that's a new phase that you're in, but it's directly related to grief.
I'm so thankful, Dina, that you are talking about the system and how you work, because I cannot tell you how pissed I am that I always had to shift who I was to accommodate someone else's bad behavior. I had to constantly shift because in order for me to do well or to do this, it was like, you've got to shift and change and be. So we had someone on with imposter syndrome, same kind of thing. It's like we go to the individual. What can you do better? You've got to work and do better. You've got to figure out your emotions. You got to do this. And finally, at some point, I'm like, no, fuck that. I was like, I am the strongest person I could ever be. You need to change. And this isn't right. And fuck that. And so like, I never said that before. I was like, okay, well, if I'm just a little nicer, if I just work really hard, if I just work more, if I was just prettier, like I have tons of journal entries. Yeah. It's painful to read my journal entries being an athlete. My 11-year-old daughter talks to me about this. She's like, how did you feel as a kid? I was like, I hated everything about myself. I just wrote all these things.
I hated everything. Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought it was me. Right? So that's, I just love it. I would have loved to fast forward and have someone as a sports psychologist to be like, you know what? We can work all day long on your resilience, but if your asshole of a coach doesn't change his, and in this system doesn't change, you will constantly be told you need to change and it has nothing to do with you. And that's what I do with my clients. I take that lesson and I have clients, women all the time. Well, I just need to be more productive, Iris. I'm like, nope. You need to say no. Because you need to also decide that if you want to be successful, you got to do it the way you want to do it. And so like for me, this fires me up because this is it. Like this is my life's work, is helping people know, you know, yes, we can absolutely change things about ourselves. Yes, there are things that we're all growing in. Yes, we can be supported and nurtured in that. And sometimes, no matter if you're the most perfect person, this isn't the right place. This isn't the right soil. This is not the right opportunity. Yes. It's time to go.
And that's the beauty of anger. What we probably won't hear a lot of is, especially for women, because we've been socialized to be more subservient.
Yes.
We get rewarded for being pretty and nice and let's go along, right? And that's some gifts of that. But the shadow side of that is, well, I'm other things too. That's that energy around masculine and feminine. Yes. And if we go back, I'll take you back 30 years when they used to talk and describe women athletes. What were they focusing on? Can you just please do the twirl? I can't remember her name, but the tennis star, right? Can you give me a little twirl, you pretty little thing? So this is what that anger, that boundary violation, I call them riverbanks. When our riverbanks have been infringed, we're just like, no, you cannot do that. So how do we create clarity about, these are my values. It's something's arising in me. Oh, it's anger. What is it about the situation that's making me so angry? Mm-hmm. My coach is, saying this and this and this, as opposed to labeling him an asshole, or like, well, when he's yelling at me and he's like the tone and he's coming and he's pointing at me, those are all behaviors that make me feel small, insignificant, not valued. So if we can give athletes language, we give the coaches the language, we do the work here and the work there, we create culture. And when we create thriving culture, people are going to stay. And when they stay, they perform. And when they perform, right, we win, right? So we stay, like, it's like this cyclical, I'm thriving, I'm staying, I'm performing. The triangle.
We're also training people in those systems to then be able to do all those things in the next job, right? And to be able to be a leader that does all those things. Yeah. So like you said, going back to the sport is a training ground for development. And when when people have that sense of belonging and safety and, the skills we always talk about here, get curious and call a friend. Why do I feel like this right now? Let me not be alone with it. Let me call somebody.
When we're more embodied, when we can drop into ourselves and feel safety, it helps us with that language, because I do think one part of the piece that I work on as a coach is helping people have that language. How do you feel about this scenario? Well, when he said this, I really felt this. And I said, have you told him that? No, I don't want to tell him that. And I said, okay, well, let's at least talk about it together. We can role play. They can talk about it. They can speak to their feelings.
I often ask clients who are, especially the ones who are more reserved, I don't want to rock the boat. So I'll ask them this question. In what ways is your silence contributing to the dysfunction in the relationship? They're like, what? In what way is your hesitation, right? This client, this female client that you were saying, so how is that contributing to this tension, this dysfunction that in this relationship with your boss? So we can only grow, I think, in cultures, athletes with coaches, and then, workers with their leaders, as far as that leader is going to work, which is why I'm so on fire with working with coaches like you, because we need coaches like us to come in and train the people who can have massive amounts of impact. And if we do in corporate, right? Corporate Canada, corporate USA, the ripple effect around people leading healthy human lives where they don't have to give up a piece of their soul every time they walk in to the work environment, then that ripples out, right? And I think it'll ripple out in really beautiful ways that we can't yet imagine.
I will say, I have been that person who, hard to say this, but who stepped back a lot so that other people could come forward. And I've been practicing using my voice because I don't want to be complicit and I don't want to be silent. And it is hard. So I actually utilize some of these grief processes because it is actually an identity that felt safe for a long time. If I'm back here and no one sees me, they won't see me, it's fine. And I'll just help everyone else and not myself.
We're behind the scenes.
I'm behind the scenes and that's okay. And then I'm starting to speak up and say, I don't like this. It is a little bit of a loss of that identity that I felt safe. So again, anytime there's transition, anytime you're trying to shift, there's going to be this place where it feels difficult. And that's why you're right about having community, because I'll reach out to Whitney and say, well, I think it's just easier if I was back here. And she's like, nope, you're going to come forward and it'll be okay. And she's there for me at those times when it is super difficult, where that identity shift is hard. So this is where everything kind of comes in. You start to speak up, you start to shift, you start to change yourself. And I do utilize some of that. Like, it is a loss, even though it's not where I want to be or who I really want to be, it's still losing that. So I still think some of this interventional work or your language or literacy of your book, which I want to make sure we talk about too, does come into play there too in that cycle, for me at least.
I just want to end by sort of bringing us full circle. The training that we as athletes and our corporate clients are doing is, I want to achieve something because then I will feel this, right? Then I will feel safe. Then I will feel, but what we're longing for is that connection to self. I will feel more like myself is what we don't know that we're actually saying. And some of the jewels, the coins, the keys, the parts of ourselves are not in the ascension, but they're in the descension. So I just want to offer this episode as like an invitation to an accompanied descension, and that it's okay, and that it's more than okay. and that it's work that we as humans need to do. So thank you so much for the work you are doing. I am just in awe.
It's been my pleasure.
Iris, final words?
I just want to say Grief Unleashed. It just came out in June, I believe, right, Dina?
Yes.
Yes. And it's not just about loss in the sense of losing someone, but it's about more than that.
Yeah, I love that. I'm trying to help people reimagine a new relationship with life losses and what you were speaking to earlier around life in transition. So when we transition from a known way of being, which is where we typically meet our clients, they have this longing to become something else.
Yeah.
And what the book does is it helps us, it provides the language, it normalizes coping strategies. My intention is to work with more coaches, people like you, because it is an embodied experience. And if we can learn how to companion, well, it's what the two of you were modeling: listening, being present to each other, asking powerful questions, noticing our scope of practice, like, ooh, it sounds like this person might need a mental health professional, and offering, like, showing up, right? Like really showing up. Because too often we'll offer platitudes. Well, at least you still have two other children. True story, right? True, but not helpful. So we teach people how to be with their own finiteness, because at some point we're not going to be here. So I'm wondering if I have time to just read this very quick little poem. Would that be okay?
Yeah. Is it David White or?
No, this is Carolyn Disconnect. And you inspired me, Whitney, because you brought in the metaphor of the butterfly, which has been, my sister Tracy's metaphor, actually. But here's what she says. Okay. So Carolyn is talking about metamorphosis, transformation. Metamorphosis could be your middle name. You shift bone in fascinating ways, reshaping as life moves in constant flux. And this is how the world truly works, in fluid steps, as the birthing and dying of seasons, ocean waves, and moon phases. We move like this too, although not always as graceful. Transformation, we've learned, is not a tender task. It's mostly ugly and disjointing before the turning out of something beautiful.
We finish by saying keep untraining, and I invite you, Dina, to say keep unleashing. So keep untraining.
Keep unleashing.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe and definitely pick up Grief Unleashed today.